A struggling father can't afford his daughter's dream prom dress, and time is running out. Just when all hope seems lost, an unexpected encounter with NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal changes everything. But this isn't just about money. It's about dignity, community, and a life-altering lesson that goes beyond wealth. Will a father's love and a stranger's kindness be enough to create a night to remember? Or will the weight of reality crush a dream before it even begins? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun peeked through the dusty blinds of a small apartment in downtown Atlanta. The air inside was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, though the man holding the steaming cup wasn't drinking it. Jonathan Pierce, a man in his early 40s with calloused hands and weary eyes, sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. His fingers drummed against the tabletop, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past few months. Money was tighter than ever, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like an unrelenting storm. Across the apartment, laughter echoed from the small bedroom. His 17-year-old daughter, Alyssa, was on the phone with her best friend, her voice bubbling with excitement. Prom was just a few weeks away, and all the girls were talking about their dresses, the perfect shoes, and the limo rides. Alyssa deserved to be part of that excitement. She was smart, kind, and had worked hard all year to maintain her grades while helping out at home. But Jonathan knew what she didn't. There was no money for a prom dress. He exhaled slowly, gripping his coffee mug as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Maybe he could pick up extra shifts at the auto shop. Maybe he could sell a few things. Maybe, just maybe, a miracle would happen. That afternoon, Jonathan stood outside Reed's Auto Repair, where he had worked for the past 15 years. He had asked his boss, Mike Reed, for an advance on his paycheck, something he had never done before. The conversation had been short, blunt, and disappointing. "John, I'd help if I could," Mike had said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But business is slow. I can barely cover payroll as it is." Jonathan had nodded, forcing a tight-lipped smile. He understood. The world didn't stop for one man's troubles. Now, as he walked home, his thoughts swirled with desperation. How could he tell Alyssa she couldn't go? How could he look into her hopeful eyes and take that joy away from her? That evening, Alyssa came into the kitchen, her curly brown hair bouncing as she moved. "Dad, I found the perfect dress," she said, pulling up a picture on her phone. "It's simple, elegant, not too expensive." Jonathan's heart clenched. Even not too expensive was out of reach. He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady, though his insides felt like they were crumbling. Alyssa hesitated. "Dad, we can afford it, right?" For a brief moment, Jonathan considered lying. But he had never lied to her before, and he wouldn't start now. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Alyssa, things are a little tight right now. Maybe we can find something more affordable." Her face fell. The light in her eyes dimmed just a little, and it shattered him. "Oh, yeah. Of course. I understand." She turned away before he could say anything else. Jonathan watched as she walked back to her room, her shoulders just a little slumped. The next morning, Jonathan sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, searching for anything. Side jobs, loan options, anything that could help. Every option led to a dead end. He needed help. And help, though he didn't know it yet, was about to come from the most unexpected place. Across town, Shaquille O'Neal walked into his favorite coffee shop, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, but still impossible to miss. At 7 feet tall, with a presence larger than life, he turned heads wherever he went. But Shaq didn't care about attention. He cared about people. He ordered his usual and stepped outside, enjoying the crisp morning air. A few feet away, he noticed a man sitting on a park bench, head in his hands, stress written all over his face. It wasn't the first time Shaq had seen a struggling father, but something about this man, his worn-out clothes, the tired slump of his shoulders, made Shaq pause. Jonathan sat on that bench, lost in thought. He had walked to the park to clear his head, but instead he found himself sinking deeper into despair. He didn't even notice when a shadow fell over him. "Hey, man. You good?" Jonathan looked up, startled. Standing in front of him was Shaquille O'Neal. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. He blinked twice, then sat up straighter. Yeah, just long day." Shaq studied him for a moment. "You sure?" Jonathan hesitated. He didn't know why, but there was something about Shaq. Something real. Something genuine. But he wasn't about to spill his troubles to a stranger, especially not someone like Shaq. "Yeah," he said again, forcing a smile. Shaq nodded, but he wasn't convinced. He had spent years reading people, and Jonathan looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. "All right, man," Shaq said, clapping Jonathan on the shoulder. "Take it easy." Jonathan watched as Shaq walked away, his massive frame blending into the morning crowd. For a moment, he wondered if he had just imagined the entire thing. Little did he know, their paths were about to cross again, this time in a way that would change everything. Alyssa sat at her usual spot in the school cafeteria, her tray untouched. The scent of greasy pizza and stale fries filled the air, but she had no appetite. Laughter and chatter surrounded her, but it all felt distant, like she was in a movie, watching everything happen from behind a thick glass wall. Across the table, her best friend Riley Dawson scrolled through her phone, grinning as she flipped through pictures of designer prom dresses. "Look at this one," Riley said, turning the screen toward Alyssa. The dress was emerald green, floor length, sleek, and expensive. "I think this is the one. My mom already put the order in." Alyssa swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. "It's gorgeous." Riley beamed, oblivious to the way Alyssa's hands curled into fists under the table. She had once imagined prom as a magical night, dancing under glittering lights, feeling beautiful, like she belonged. But now it felt like a dream meant for other girls. A group of girls at the next table erupted into laughter. Alyssa didn't need to look to know who it was. Kelsey Monroe, the daughter of a wealthy lawyer, was at the center of the conversation, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. "Ugh, can you imagine showing up in some off-the-rack disaster?" Kelsey said, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Prom is the most important night of high school. If you can't afford to look good, why even bother going?" The words sliced through Alyssa like a blade. She knew Kelsey wasn't speaking directly to her, but the meaning was clear enough. Before Alyssa could react, Riley scoffed. "Seriously, Kelsey? Not everyone has a rich daddy to buy them whatever they want." Kelsey smirked, completely unbothered. "Oh, come on, Riley. It's not my fault some people don't plan ahead." She flicked her gaze toward Alyssa for just a second, just long enough for the message to land. Alyssa felt her stomach twist. She couldn't sit there another second. The walls of the cafeteria felt like they were closing in, the noise buzzing in her ears like static. She grabbed her bag and stood abruptly. "I'll see you in class," she mumbled before hurrying out. Riley called after her, but Alyssa didn't stop. She wandered the halls aimlessly, trying to steady her breathing. She hated that Kelsey's words had gotten to her. But they had. And what was worse? Deep down, she wondered if Kelsey was right. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a text from her dad. "Dad. Hey, sweetheart. How's your day?" Alyssa stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she felt embarrassed, that she wished things were different, that she was tired of pretending everything was okay. But she knew how hard he was trying. She knew the late nights, the extra shifts, the exhaustion in his eyes. The last thing she wanted was to add to his stress. She took a deep breath and typed back. "Alyssa. Good. Just busy with school stuff. Love you." She hit send before she could change her mind and shoved her phone back into her pocket. That evening, Alyssa sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through pictures of prom dresses. Her eyes lingered on one, a soft blue gown with delicate beading along the waist. It wasn't extravagant, not like the ones Riley or Kelsey were getting, but it was beautiful. Simple. Elegant. It was the dress she had imagined herself wearing. She checked the price. Her chest tightened. Even with the on-sale tag blinking in bright red, It was still too much. Alyssa set her phone down and stared at the ceiling. She thought about what Kelsey had said. If you can't afford to look good, why even bother going? Maybe she was right. Maybe prom wasn't meant for people like her. Her bedroom door creaked open, and her dad poked his head inside. "Hey, kiddo." She quickly flipped her phone over. "Hey, Dad." Jonathan stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe. He looked exhausted. His blue work shirt wrinkled, his dark hair slightly grayer at the temples than it had been a year ago. "You okay?" Alyssa hesitated. The words were right there on the tip of her tongue. She wanted to tell him everything, about Kelsey's comment, about how out of place she felt, about how much she wanted to go to prom but knew she couldn't. But then she saw the worry etched into his face, the lines on his forehead that hadn't been there when she was younger. She couldn't do that to him. "Yeah," she said instead. "Just tired." Jonathan studied her for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines. Finally, he nodded. "You know you can talk to me, right?" She forced a smile. "I know." He walked over, pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and squeezed her shoulder. "Get some rest, sweetheart." She waited until she heard his footsteps fade down the hall before letting out a slow breath. She hated this, the pretending, the half-truths. But what choice did she have? She picked up her phone, took one last look at the dress, then turned off the screen and climbed under the covers. Maybe if she told herself prom didn't matter, she'd eventually believe it. But deep down, she already knew that was a lie. Jonathan Pierce had never been the kind of man to ask for help. He prided himself on hard work, on earning every dollar with sweat and effort. But as he sat in the break room at Reed's Auto Repair, staring at his phone screen, he knew he was out of options. His bank account was nearly empty, his bills were overdue, and prom was only a few weeks away. He had promised Alyssa nothing, but that didn't change the way her face had fallen when he'd hesitated about the dress. He had to find a way. Mike Reed, his boss, walked in, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. Jonathan hesitated before speaking, swallowing his pride. "Mike, I, was wondering if I could pick up some extra shifts, nights, weekends, whatever you've got." Mike sighed, shaking his head. "John, you know I'd help if I could. But business is slow, and I'm already cutting hours where I can." He clapped Jonathan on the shoulder. "I'm real sorry, man." Jonathan nodded, forcing himself to accept it. "Yeah, I get it." But as he walked back to the garage, tightening his grip on his work gloves, he knew that understanding wouldn't get Alyssa that dress. That evening, after finishing his shift, Jonathan walked down the dimly lit streets of downtown Atlanta, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had already checked in with Jimmy's Diner, Quick Mart gas station, and even an overnight security job that paid under the table. Nothing. No one was hiring, at least not fast enough. The last stop on his list was Collins Pawn and Loan. It wasn't the kind of place he liked going to, but at this point, his pride mattered less than his daughter's happiness. Inside, the shop smelled of dust and old wood. The glass cases displayed watches, jewelry, and small electronics, while guitars hung from the walls, their strings collecting dust. Paul Collins, the owner, stood behind the counter, looking as uninterested as ever. Jonathan pulled a silver wristwatch from his pocket and set it on the glass. "How much can you give me for this?" Paul picked it up, inspecting it under the dim light. "It's in decent shape," he muttered. "But this ain't exactly a Rolex, John." Jonathan shifted on his feet. "I know. Just give me whatever you can." Paul smirked, shaking his head. $30. Jonathan's stomach sank. "Paul, come on. It's worth more than that." Paul leaned on the counter, looking bored. "Then sell it somewhere else." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "I need at least 100. Paul gave him a long look, then set the watch back on the counter. "Not my problem." A slow anger burned in Jonathan's chest, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't about to lose his temper in a pawn shop. Without another word, he grabbed the watch and walked out into the cool night air. By the time Jonathan got home, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He found Alyssa in her room, curled up on her bed with her laptop open. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, surprised. "Hey, Dad, you're home late." "Yeah." he admitted, rubbing his neck. Long day. She studied him for a moment, her brows furrowing. Did you eat? Jonathan smiled. You sound like your grandma. Alyssa rolled her eyes. That's not an answer. He walked over, sitting on the edge of her bed. I grabbed something earlier. Don't worry about me. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Jonathan glanced at her laptop screen. The Prom website was open, with a countdown clock ticking away the days. She noticed where he was looking and quickly closed the tab. Jonathan's heart ached. Alyssa. It's fine, Dad, she said quickly. Really, Prom's not a big deal. But it was. He could see it in her eyes. He reached out and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Get some sleep, kiddo. She nodded, forcing a smile. Night, Dad. Jonathan left her room, his heart heavy. He had to fix this. The next morning, Jonathan's search for extra work continued. Between oil changes and brake replacements at the shop, he called old friends, checked job listings, and even considered asking his landlord for a delay on rent, though he knew it wouldn't do much good. By lunchtime, he was exhausted, his hope dwindling. He sat on a bench outside a corner coffee shop, rubbing his temples. That's when he saw him. Shaquille O'Neal. The man was impossible to miss. Tall, broad, larger than life. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other guy grabbing a morning coffee. But to the people around him, he was a legend. Jonathan had seen Shaq around the neighborhood before. He'd heard stories about how he helped people, how he walked into stores and paid for strangers' groceries, how he tipped waitresses thousands of dollars just because. He had always admired him, but from a distance. Now, as Shaq laughed with the barista inside, Jonathan hesitated. Should he ask him for help? Would it be humiliating? Would Shaq even care? The idea sat heavy in his chest, but Jonathan couldn't bring himself to do it. He stood up and walked away. That night, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table staring at his watch. $30. That's what Paul Collins had offered him. It wouldn't even cover a fraction of the dress. He turned the watch over in his hands, thinking. His father had given it to him years ago, back when times were different, when life didn't feel like an uphill battle every single day. He had always promised himself he'd never sell it, but promises didn't put food on the table. Promises didn't buy dresses. Jonathan exhaled slowly, gripping the watch tighter. He had one more place to try, and if that didn't work, he wasn't sure what he was going to do. Jonathan Pierce trudged down the cracked sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his worn-out jacket. The early evening breeze had a slight chill, but he barely noticed. His mind was too cluttered with worry, too weighed down by the feeling of defeat. He had spent the entire day looking for extra work, any opportunity to scrape together enough money for Alyssa's prom dress. And yet, here he was, empty-handed, exhausted, and out of time. He exhaled heavily as he neared a strip mall, its neon lights flickering against the dimming sky. The scent of fresh donuts wafted from Benny's Donut Shop, a small family-owned place that had been around since he was a kid. He hesitated, debating whether he should even step inside. He didn't have money to spare, but maybe a coffee would clear his mind. As Jonathan pushed the door open, the tiny bell overhead jingled. He barely paid attention to the handful of customers inside, until he noticed the 7-foot-tall man standing near the counter. Shaquille O'Neal. Jonathan stopped mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. It was one thing to see Shaq from a distance, like he had the other day at the coffee shop, but standing just a few feet away from him was something else entirely. The man was a living legend, a household name. And yet here he was, laughing with the cashier like he was just another guy stopping by for a snack. Shaq leaned against the counter, dressed casually in a gray hoodie and sweatpants. His massive frame made the tiny shop feel even smaller. He had just placed his order, half a dozen glazed donuts and a large chocolate milk, and was waiting as the cashier bagged up his items. Jonathan quickly turned toward the menu, hoping to avoid any awkward eye contact. He didn't need another reminder of how different their worlds were. One man, larger than life, with more money than he could ever spend, and the other, a father struggling to buy his daughter a simple dress. "You good, big man?" Jonathan stiffened. He turned slightly, realizing Shaq was looking directly at him. There was no arrogance in Shaq's expression, No expectation that Jonathan should recognize him. Just a simple, genuine curiosity. Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't good. But what was the point of unloading his troubles on a stranger, especially one like Shaq? So he forced a polite nod. Yeah, just long day. Shaq studied him for a moment, then grinned. Man, I feel that. The cashier handed Shaq his bag, and he stepped aside, giving Jonathan space to order. Jonathan fished through his wallet, counting out the exact amount for a small black coffee. As the cashier rang him up, he could feel Shaq's presence still lingering nearby. You work around here? Shaq asked casually. Jonathan nodded, still avoiding eye contact. Yeah, over at Reed's Auto Repair. Been there a while. Shaq's face lit up. No way. Man, I used to bring my Jeep there a few years back. Mike's still running the place? Jonathan finally looked up, a bit surprised. Yeah, he's still there. Shaq chuckled. Good dude. Honest, too. Hard to find that in car shops these days. Jonathan let out a small laugh. Yeah, he's a straight shooter. There was a brief pause, and for a moment, Jonathan thought Shaq was going to walk away. But instead, he gestured toward one of the booths near the window. I'm about to sit and eat. You want to join me? Jonathan hesitated. Every instinct told him to say no. Why would Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had played in the NBA, won championships, built an empire, want to sit and talk to him? But before he could overthink it, he heard himself mumble, yeah. Sure. The two men sat across from each other in the booth. Shaq took a big bite of his donut, washing it down with chocolate milk. He was impossibly relaxed, as if this were just another regular evening, talking to a friend. So, what's got you down, man? Shaq asked, breaking the silence. Jonathan tensed. He hadn't planned on actually talking about his problems. I'm fine. Just life, you know? Shaq raised an eyebrow. Man, you don't sit like that when you're fine. Jonathan huffed a small laugh, shaking his head. You don't even know me. I know people, Shaq countered. And I know when someone's carrying something heavy. Jonathan stared at the table, drumming his fingers against the surface. He hadn't spoken about his struggles to anyone, not Mike, not even Alyssa. But something about Shaq's easygoing nature made it feel safe. Like maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be judged. It's my daughter, Jonathan admitted, his voice quiet. Prom's coming up and she really wants to go. She found a dress she loves, but... He exhaled sharply. I can't afford it. I've been working extra shifts, looking for side jobs, even tried pawning a few things. Nothing's working out. Shaq leaned back, nodding slowly. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer immediate solutions. He just listened. Jonathan let out a bitter chuckle. I know it's stupid. It's just a dress, right? But it's more than that. She's been through a lot these past few years, and she deserves to have one night where she doesn't have to think about money, or bills, or how hard things have been. I want to give her that. Shaq set his chocolate milk down. Ain't stupid at all, man. Jonathan looked up, surprised. Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. You ever hear about my mom, Lucille? Jonathan frowned slightly. I mean, I know she raised you. Shaq nodded. Raised 4 of us, mostly on her own. We didn't have much, but she always found a way to make sure we felt special. She used to tell me, it ain't about what you wear, it's about how you feel in it. Jonathan swallowed hard. Shaq smiled. You're a good dad, John. I can see it, and I respect that. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his hands together. Thanks, but respect doesn't buy a dress. Shaq smirked. Nah, but money does. Jonathan's eyes widened. Shaq, I'm not asking for... Shaq held up a hand. I know you're not, but I'm offering. Jonathan shook his head. I can't take charity. Shaq grinned. Who said anything about charity? Think of it like a favor. One dad to another. Jonathan hesitated. Everything in him screamed to say no. But then he thought about Alyssa, about the way she had closed her laptop screen, about the disappointment she had tried to hide. Finally, he exhaled, nodding slowly. Okay. Shaq grinned wider. Good. Now you like glazed donuts? 'Cause I got too many. For the first time in days, Jonathan actually laughed. Jonathan sat across from Shaq in the tiny booth at Benny's donut shop, still trying to process what had just happened. Shaq had offered to help, not just with a little cash, but with something bigger, something Jonathan hadn't fully grasped yet. He had agreed to it, but now, staring at the 7-foot giant as he casually sipped his chocolate milk, he wondered, what exactly had he agreed to? Shaq leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the table. All right, John, let's get one thing straight. I ain't just gonna hand you a check and call it a day. That's not how I do things. Jonathan exhaled, relieved but still confused. I appreciate that. But what is your plan? A slow grin spread across Shaq's face. You trust me? Jonathan hesitated. Trust? That was a big word. He barely knew Shaq outside of what he'd seen on TV or in the news. But something about the man felt genuine, like he actually cared. Not just about helping, but about making sure Jonathan kept his dignity intact. Jonathan nodded. Yeah, I think I do. Shaq clapped his hands together. Good. Then don't worry about the how. Just know your daughter's gonna have the best prom night of her life. Jonathan opened his mouth to press for details, but Shaq was already sliding out of the booth. You gotta be at work tomorrow? Yeah, same shift as usual. Good. Then do what you always do. And let me handle the rest. With that, Shaq patted Jonathan on the back and strode toward the door, leaving behind nothing but a half-empty chocolate milk and a whole lot of questions. The next morning, Jonathan tried to shake the lingering confusion from his mind as he walked into Reed's auto repair. He had barely settled into his routine when his boss, Mike Reed, called him into the office. Close the door, Mike said, leaning against his desk with an odd look on his face. Jonathan frowned but did as he was told. Everything okay? Mike studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. I got a call this morning from Shaquille O'Neal. Jonathan's stomach flipped. What? Mike crossed his arms. Said he wanted to do something for you but knew you wouldn't take a handout. So instead, he offered me a business deal. He's paying for a full garage remodel. New lifts, new tools, the whole 9 yards. Jonathan's mouth went dry. You're kidding. Mike shook his head. Nope. And all he asked for in return? He smirked. To give you a bonus. A big one. Jonathan's hands gripped the chair in front of him. Mike, Don't start, Mike interrupted, holding up a hand. I know what you're gonna say, but look, this shop's been falling apart for years. We've needed this upgrade. So if Shaq wants to throw some money at it and help you out at the same time, who am I to argue? Jonathan felt his chest tighten. This wasn't charity. This was Shaq playing chess while he'd been stuck playing checkers. Mike grinned. I just transferred the money to your account. Consider it your early bonus. Jonathan didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or collapse. Instead, he just whispered, Thank you. By the time Jonathan got home that evening, he felt like he was walking in a daze. The money was in his account. Enough for Alyssa's dress, plus a little extra to catch up on bills. He should have been relieved. He should have felt like he could finally breathe. And yet, something about this still didn't feel done. As he stepped inside, he found Alyssa sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine with a distracted look on her face. She glanced up, forcing a small smile. Hey, Dad. Hey, sweetheart. Jonathan hesitated, then cleared his throat. Listen, I was thinking, if you still want that dress, we can go get it tomorrow. Alyssa froze, the magazine slipping from her fingers. Wait. What? Jonathan sat beside her, nodding. I mean it. We can go tomorrow. For a second, Alyssa just stared at him, like she didn't quite believe it. Then, all at once, she launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Oh my God, Dad, thank you, thank you, thank you. Jonathan hugged her tightly, swallowing the lump in his throat. This is why he had fought so hard. The next afternoon, they drove to Cambridge Boutique, one of the nicest dress shops in town. Alyssa was practically vibrating with excitement as she pulled the dress from the rack, the soft blue gown she had been dreaming of. As she twirled in front of the mirror, Jonathan felt a deep sense of relief. He had done it. He had given her this moment. But something still nagged at him. He had the dress, but what about the rest? The shoes, the limo, the experience. That's when his phone buzzed. A new text. From Shaq. Shaq. Meet me at Benny's at 7. We ain't done yet. Jonathan exhaled. Of course. That night, Jonathan arrived at Benny's donut shop right on time. Shaq was already there, sitting in the same booth, sipping another chocolate milk. Jonathan slid into the seat across from him. All right, man. What else are you up to? Shaq grinned. Thought you'd never ask. He leaned forward. Listen, we got the dress handled. But prom, it ain't just about what you wear. It's about the experience. So I made a few calls. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Shaq, hear me out. Shaq held up a hand. Alyssa's got the dress. Now she's got a custom-fitted pair of designer shoes already paid for. And a limo, done. Top-tier service all night, anywhere she wants to go. Jonathan just blinked. You did all that? Shaq smirked. Oh, and one more thing. I got her a seat at the VIP dinner at the venue before prom starts. Best food, best treatment, the full experience. Jonathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Shaq grinned wider. Oh, and I got her hair and makeup booked too. Can't have her showing up anything less than flawless. Jonathan rubbed a hand down his face. Shaq, this is too much. Shaq tilted his head. Let me ask you something. You think Alyssa deserves to feel special? Jonathan swallowed. Of course. Then let her. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He didn't know how to thank Shaq. Words didn't seem like enough. Finally, he just shook his head and laughed. Man, you really don't do anything small, do you? Shaq grinned. Where's the fun in small? Jonathan laughed again, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, things were looking up. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at Reed's Auto Repair, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The stress that had been gnawing at him for so long had finally started to ease. Alyssa's prom night was coming together, thanks to Shaq. But what Jonathan didn't know was that Shaq had one more trick up his sleeve. As soon as Jonathan stepped into the garage, he noticed something was off. His co-workers were grinning at him. Not in the usual way, but like they knew something he didn't. Mike Reed walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. You got a minute? Jonathan frowned. Yeah? Mike motioned for him to follow. They walked past the main floor and into the break room, where a brand new toolbox sat in the center of the room, sleek, top of the line, stocked with the best tools money could buy. Jonathan's name was engraved on the side. His breath caught. What is this? He asked, his voice uneven. Mike chuckled. A gift. From the community, Jonathan turned, eyes wide. The community? Mike crossed his arms, his smirk widening. Word got out about you doing everything you could to make prom special for your daughter. People wanted to help. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He never asked for help, but somehow, people knew. Who did this? Mike shrugged. Let's just say a certain 7-foot giant may have spread the word. Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head. Shaq. His throat tightened, but before he could process everything, the shop's front door slammed open. A familiar, furious voice echoed through the building. You gotta be kidding me. Jonathan turned, his stomach dropping as Paul Collins stormed into the garage. The pawnshop owner's face was twisted in a sneer, his beady eyes darting between Jonathan and Mike. Paul, Mike said, his voice careful. Something I can help you with? Paul scoffed. Yeah, you can explain why I got a bunch of people calling me this morning, saying I should have helped out poor old Jonathan instead of turning him away. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Paul turned his glare on him. You go running around town telling people I wouldn't give you money, that I'm some kind of villain? Jonathan shook his head. I never said a word to anyone. Paul let out a dry laugh. Oh, I know. But I also know you've been cozying up to Shaq freaking O'Neal. He spat the name like it was poison. And now, suddenly, the whole damn town is rallying behind you? He stepped closer. You think that's fair? That I gotta be the bad guy in all this? Jonathan met his gaze, refusing to back down. I didn't ask anyone to do anything, Paul. Paul scoffed. Yeah? Well, congratulations. You got your handouts. Jonathan's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. I don't owe you an explanation. Paul shook his head, laughing bitterly. You know what? Forget it. Enjoy your little charity parade, John. Hope you like being the town's newest sob story. With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out. The room was silent for a long moment before Mike let out a low whistle. Damn, that guy's got a stick so far up his... Jonathan sighed. Don't. He's not worth it. Mike patted him on the back. You're a good man, John. Don't let some bitter old pawnshop owner ruin this for you. Jonathan nodded, but Paul's words still lingered. That evening, Jonathan met Shaq at Benny's donut shop, the familiar booth now feeling like a second home. Shaq was already there, sipping his usual chocolate milk. Man, Jonathan said as he sat down, you really couldn't just leave it at the dress and the limo, huh? Shaq smirked. What can I say? I like going big. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his temples. The toolbox, the community, all of it. That was you, wasn't it? Shaq shrugged. Nah, that was them. I just made sure they knew. Jonathan shook his head. I don't even know how to thank you. Shaq set his drink down and leaned forward. Let me ask you something. When's the last time you let people show up for you? Jonathan opened his mouth, then shut it. Shaq nodded knowingly. Yeah, that's what I thought. Jonathan sighed. I'm not used to this. People helping me. Shaq smiled. Ain't about what you're used to. It's about what you deserve. Jonathan swallowed hard, staring at his hands. Listen, man, Shaq continued. I've been where you are. Not financially, maybe. But I know what it's like to feel like you gotta do it all alone. Like asking for help makes you less of a man. Jonathan exhaled. Doesn't it? Shaq shook his head. Nah. Let me tell you something my mom always said. Real strength ain't about doing it alone. It's about knowing when to let people stand beside you. Jonathan's throat tightened. Shaq leaned back, grinning. Also, you suck at accepting gifts, like real bad. Jonathan laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, I guess I do. Shaq raised his chocolate milk. Then consider this practice. Jonathan lifted his coffee in return. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The sun had barely begun to set when Jonathan stood outside Alyssa's bedroom door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen his daughter in every stage of life. Her first steps, her first day of school, the time she lost her first tooth. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't a little girl anymore. He knocked softly. Alyssa, you ready? A moment of silence passed before the door creaked open. And then, there she was. Alyssa stood in the doorway, wearing the soft blue gown she had dreamed of for weeks. The delicate beading along the waist shimmered under the light, and the way the fabric flowed made her look almost weightless. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, a few loose strands framing her face. The makeup was subtle but highlighted her features in a way that made Jonathan realize just how grown up she was. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. Wow, you look like a princess? Alyssa teased, twirling slightly. Jonathan let out a small laugh. Better than a princess. Alyssa beamed, but then something shifted in her expression. Jonathan noticed it immediately. Hey, what's wrong? Alyssa hesitated, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. It's just, this is everything I wanted. The dress, the limo, the whole experience. But, she bit her lip. I keep thinking about the fact that we almost couldn't afford it. I keep thinking about how unfair that is. Jonathan's heart clenched. Sweetheart. She shook her head. No, Dad, I mean it. There are kids at my school who aren't going tonight because they couldn't afford to. And it doesn't feel right. Jonathan was speechless. He had spent so much time trying to make sure Alyssa had this moment, but he never expected her to think beyond herself. Then, before he could say another word, a deep voice echoed from behind him. She's got a good heart, John. Jonathan turned to see Shaq standing in the hallway, leaning casually against the wall, his massive frame barely fitting in the small space. He wore a sleek black suit, custom-tailored, of course, but despite his size and celebrity status, there was something undeniably warm about him. Alyssa's eyes widened. Shaq? Shaq grinned. You didn't think I was going to miss the big night, did you? Jonathan chuckled. You're full of surprises, man. Shaq shrugged. It's what I do. Then he turned back to Alyssa. Listen, kid. What you just said, that's some real stuff right there. Not everyone would stop and think about that. Alyssa looked down, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. I don't want to forget how lucky I am. Shaq smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Good thing you don't have to. Jonathan and Alyssa exchanged a confused glance. Shaq tapped his phone screen a few times, then turned it around to show them a video call. On the other end, a group of high school students were gathered in a community center, dressed in beautiful prom outfits, grinning excitedly. Alyssa gasped. Wait, who are they? Shaq's smile widened. Kids from your school? The ones who couldn't afford to go to prom? Well, guess what? They're going now. Alyssa's hands flew to her mouth. No way. Shaq nodded. Way. See, while y'all were getting ready, I made a few calls. Found some folks willing to donate dresses, tuxes, even got a venue set up for him with a DJ, catering, the whole deal. Jonathan was stunned. Shaq, you did all this? Shaq chuckled. Man, I told you, I don't do small. Alyssa's eyes filled with tears. This is incredible. One of the kids on the screen, a girl in a sparkly silver dress, smiled at her. Alyssa, thank you. Shaq said this was your idea. Alyssa's breath hitched. It wasn't. She looked up at Shaq, who simply winked. Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder. Take the credit, sweetheart. You deserve it. Alyssa wiped at her eyes, then smiled at the screen. Have the best night ever, guys. The kids on the call cheered before Shaq ended the video. Alyssa turned to him, still overwhelmed. I don't even know what to say. Shaq grinned. Say you're ready to go have a prom night you'll never forget. Alyssa laughed, nodding. I'm ready. The limo pulled up outside the apartment complex, sleek and shining under the streetlights. Alyssa stepped outside, the train of her dress flowing behind her as Jonathan followed, adjusting his tie. Before she got into the car, she turned to her father and threw her arms around him. I love you, Dad, she whispered. Jonathan held her close. I love you more, sweetheart. Shaq cleared his throat dramatically. All right. Enough of the Hallmark moment, we got a prom to get to. Alyssa laughed, stepping back. She climbed into the limo, her excitement radiating. Jonathan turned to Shaq, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you, man. Shaq placed a giant hand on his shoulder. You already did. As the limo drove away, Jonathan watched it disappear into the night, his heart full. Prom night wasn't just about a dress, it was about something bigger. And thanks to Shaq, it had become a night no one would ever forget. The night sky stretched over Atlanta, filled with the soft glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic. Jonathan stood outside his apartment, watching the limo disappear down the road, carrying his daughter to a night she would never forget. His heart was full, but something inside him still wrestled with everything that had happened. He turned to Shaq, who stood beside him, hands in his pockets, looking at the same dark sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the evening, the impact of everything Shaq had done, still lingered between them. Jonathan cleared his throat. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just another rich guy who liked throwing money at problems. Shaq smirked. And now? Jonathan exhaled. Now I see you for what you really are. Someone who sees people. He looked at Shaq. But I gotta ask, man, why? Why go this far for us? Shaq was quiet for a moment, staring out into the night. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier. Because I was you, John. Jonathan frowned, confused. Come on, man. You've been rich longer than most people have been alive. Shaq nodded. Yeah, I got money now. But that ain't where I come from. He turned to face Jonathan fully. You ever hear about my mom, Lucille O'Neal? Jonathan nodded. I know she raised you mostly on her own. Shaq's expression softened. She raised 4 kids on her own. We didn't always have what we needed. I remember nights when she went without food so we could eat. I remember the times we struggled to keep the lights on, the rent paid. And you know what she told me? Jonathan shook his head. She said, We may not have much, but we always have each other. And that's what really matters. Jonathan swallowed hard. Shaq continued. See, my mom never let us feel less than just 'cause we didn't have money. And she always said, if you ever get the chance to make life easier for someone else, you do it. He gestured toward the now empty street. That's why I do what I do. Because I remember what it feels like to struggle. And I remember what it feels like when somebody shows up. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn, man. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, heavy stuff. Jonathan let out a short laugh. No kidding. He looked up again. But you didn't just help me with money, Shaq. You made sure I kept my dignity. You made sure Alyssa learned something real tonight. Shaq smiled. Because money don't fix everything, John. Sometimes it ain't about dollars. It's about showing up for people. Jonathan nodded slowly. He had spent his whole life believing that asking for help made a man weak. That taking charity was some kind of failure. But tonight, he saw things differently. Shaq hadn't just helped. He had given Jonathan something priceless. The ability to stand tall. Meanwhile, inside the limo, Alyssa sat with her best friend Riley, the night's events still swirling in her mind. The dress, the limo, the surprise Shaq had pulled off. It was all unbelievable. But what stuck with her most wasn't the luxury. It was what those kids on the video call had said. Shaq said this was your idea. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make a difference. She was just a high school senior trying to get through life. But tonight, she had seen something bigger than herself. She turned to Riley. You ever think about how much we take for granted? Riley raised an eyebrow. Okay, deep thoughts before prom. What's up? Alyssa hesitated. I never really thought about what it means to have something, until I almost didn't. She looked down at her dress, running her fingers over the fabric. And now, I keep thinking about all the people who go through life always feeling like that. Riley leaned back, nodding. Yeah, it's messed up how unfair life is. Alyssa exhaled. I don't want to forget this feeling. I don't want to just move on after tonight like none of this happened. Riley smirked. So what? You gonna become a full-time activist now? Alyssa laughed. Maybe not full-time, but I want to do something. Maybe start a prom fund at school for kids who can't afford to go next year. Riley's eyes widened. Yo, that's actually a dope idea. Alyssa's heart raced a little. Yeah? Hell yeah. We can do a fundraiser, get the PTA involved, maybe even get Shaq to back us. Riley wiggled her eyebrows. Dude literally bought you a whole prom. Pretty sure he'd be down. Alyssa grinned. You think so? Riley scoffed. Alyssa, Shaq loves this kind of stuff. Alyssa nodded slowly, a sense of purpose settling over her. Tonight wasn't just about her prom night. It was about something bigger, and she was ready to be part of it. By the time the limo pulled up to the venue, the excitement was buzzing through Alyssa's veins. As she stepped out onto the red-carpeted entrance, she turned one last time to her father, who stood nearby, watching her with pride. She ran up to him, throwing her arms around his neck. Thank you, Dad. For everything. Jonathan hugged her tight, his voice thick with emotion. No, sweetheart. Thank you. As Alyssa joined her friends and walked inside, Shaq clapped a hand on Jonathan's back. You did good, man. Jonathan exhaled, nodding. So did you. Shaq smirked. So we celebrating or what? 'Cause I know a place with the best fried chicken in Atlanta. Jonathan chuckled. Lead the way, big man. As they walked off together, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Because tonight, he had learned something life-changing. Help isn't just about money. It's about showing up. It's about community. It's about knowing that you're never truly alone. And thanks to Shaq, he would never forget it. The morning after prom, sunlight streamed through the curtains of the small apartment, painting the walls with soft golden hues. Jonathan Pierce stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. But his mind was somewhere else. Last night had been a whirlwind. Alyssa glowing with happiness, Shaq pulling off yet another miracle. and an overwhelming feeling of something new settling deep in Jonathan's chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt light. Alyssa emerged from her room, still in her pajamas, her hair messy from a night of dancing. She yawned, rubbing her eyes before plopping onto the couch with a content sigh. "Morning, Dad." Jonathan smiled, taking a sip of coffee. "Morning, sweetheart. You sleep okay?" She stretched lazily. "Barely. Best night ever." She turned her head toward him. "I still can't believe everything that happened. The limo, the dress, the surprise prom for those kids." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Shaq is seriously unreal." Jonathan chuckled. "Yeah, he has a way of making the impossible seem normal." Alyssa sat up, her expression shifting to something more thoughtful. "Dad?" "Yeah?" She hesitated, then said, "I don't want this to just be a memory." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want to go back to life like nothing happened. I want to keep that feeling going, you know?" She exhaled. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about last night, about how unfair it is that some kids can't go to prom just because they can't afford it. And I want to do something about it." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Alyssa sat up straighter. "Like starting a fund at school, a prom for all kind of thing. So next year, no one has to miss out because of money." Jonathan stared at her for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. She was so much more than he had ever imagined, strong, compassionate, driven. "That's an incredible idea," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Alyssa beamed. "You really think so?" "I know so." Later that afternoon, Jonathan walked into Reed's auto repair, feeling different. It wasn't just because of the new tools or the surprise bonus Shaq had arranged. It was because, for the first time in years, he believed in himself again. Mike Reed looked up from under the hood of a car, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, if it ain't Mr. Prom Night himself." Jonathan rolled his eyes but smirked. "Don't start, Mike." Mike laughed. "I heard all about it. Can't believe Shaq pulled off another miracle." He clapped Jonathan on the back. "But you know what? You should give yourself some credit too. You fought for your daughter, John. You never gave up." Jonathan exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I guess I did." Mike leaned against the workbench. "You ever thought about moving up here? Maybe taking on more responsibility? I could use a guy like you in management." Jonathan's eyes widened. "Wait, are you serious?" Mike grinned. "Hell yeah, I'm serious. You've been here 15 years, John. You know this shop better than anyone. And now that we're getting a remodel thanks to your 7-foot guardian angel, I need someone I can trust to help run things." Jonathan didn't know what to say. A few weeks ago he had felt stuck, barely scraping by. And now doors were opening. A slow smile spread across his face. "I'd love that, Mike." Mike nodded. "Good. We'll talk details soon. But first," he smirked, "go call Shaq and tell him I want courtside seats next season." Jonathan laughed. "Yeah, good luck with that." Later that evening, Jonathan found himself standing outside Benny's donut shop, waiting at their usual booth. He had texted Shaq earlier, asking if he wanted to grab a coffee, and the response had been instant. "Shaq. Already there, big man. Don't be late." When Jonathan stepped inside, Shaq was exactly where he expected him to be. His massive frame somehow squeezed into the booth, a half-eaten donut in one hand and a chocolate milk in the other. Jonathan slid into the seat across from him. "You know, for a guy who's in peak physical shape, you sure eat like a kid." Shaq grinned. "Life's short, John. Eat the damn donut." Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "So, I wanted to say thanks. Again." Shaq waved a hand. "Man, I told you. You don't gotta thank me." Jonathan sighed. "I know. But it's not just about what you did for Alyssa. It's about what you reminded me of." He leaned forward. "You made me realize that helping people doesn't make you weak. It doesn't mean you failed. It means you have people who care." Shaq nodded slowly. "Yeah, man. That's the real secret. Nobody does it alone." Jonathan smirked. "Not even you?" Shaq laughed. "Hell no. You think I got here by myself? Man, I had my mom, my coaches, my teammates, my people. Everybody needs somebody. Jonathan exhaled. Yeah, I get that now. Shaq took a long sip of his chocolate milk, then set it down. So, what's next for you, big man? Jonathan grinned. Actually, Mike offered me a management position today. Shaq's eyebrows lifted. Oh, look at you. Moving up in the world. Jonathan chuckled. Yeah, and Alyssa's already planning a prom fund for next year. Shaq's face lit up. See, that's what I like to hear. Keep that chain going, man. Jonathan nodded. Yeah, I will. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Shaq leaned back. All right, I gotta bounce. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Somewhere important? Shaq smirked. Always. But first, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, sliding it across the table. Jonathan picked it up and frowned. What's this? It was a VIP pass. For what? Jonathan asked. Shaq grinned. Next time I'm courtside at a game, you're coming with me. Jonathan stared at the pass, then looked up at Shaq. You're serious? Shaq stood, patting Jonathan on the shoulder. Dead serious. You earned it, man. And besides, he smirked. Somebody's got to keep me humble. Jonathan laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, good luck with that. Shaq winked. See you soon, John. And with that, he was gone. As Jonathan walked home that night, something inside him felt different. Not just relief, not just gratitude, hope. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the future. He wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. And he had Shaq, and a whole community, to thank for that. This wasn't just a happy ending. This was a new beginning. No one should miss out on life's biggest moments just because of financial struggles. This story isn't just about a prom dress. It's about dignity, kindness, and the power of showing up for each other. If this story moved you, be someone's Shaq. Support local families, donate to community funds, or simply lend a helping hand when someone needs it most. Want to stay connected and be part of more inspiring stories? Follow us, share this story, and join the movement to make a difference. One small act of kindness at a time. Because sometimes the biggest impact starts with just showing up.